The boardroom smelled of stale coffee and fraud. Silas Vance slammed his fist on the mahogany table. "Apologize to her or you're confined?" My billionaire dad roared at me. I was 30 years old. I looked at his $19 billion contract and simply said, "I'll go now." But that realization was hours away. Right now. He just looked smug. Right now, he just looked smug. Before the shouting, the atmosphere was clinical. We were reviewing the final terms for Project Ether. My brother, Caleb, sat to my right, ignoring the dense legal text. I had flagged page 50 3 times. The intellectual property clause listed Vance Global as the sole creator of the source code. It was a lie. I built Aether in a basement server farm while they were golfing. I tapped the paper. "This clause is invalid," I said quietly. "The core architecture belongs to the developer, not the corporation." Silas didn't look up. He viewed me as a depreciating asset, useful only for photo ops or strategic marriages. "Juniper, stop trying to complicate the deal just to feel important," he sneered. Caleb snickered, finally looking up from his screen. "Yeah, June. It's standard boilerplate. Dad paid for the electricity." So Dad owns the brain." The general counsel nodded, afraid to contradict the paycheck. They saw a daughter playing with computers. They didn't see the architect of their entire valuation. "I am preventing federal fraud charges," I insisted. "You cannot sell what you do not legally own." That was when his fiancée, Elena, chimed in. "She's just jealous, Silas. It's sad." I turned my gaze to her. "And you are a spectator with no equity, Elena. Quiet down." That was the spark. Silas exploded. The veins in his neck bulged against his starch collar. He stood up, towering over the table, and delivered the ultimatum that would end his empire. The echo of his roar faded, replaced by the hum of the air conditioning. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I stood up and smoothed my skirt. "If I am confined, I suppose I won't be needing this," I said. I slid my company phone across the polished wood. It spun and stopped perfectly in front of Caleb. He looked confused, like a dog shown a card trick. They thought they were cutting off my lifeline. They didn't realize I had just handed them a brick. 2 security guards escorted me to the private elevator. They avoided eye contact. Ashamed to be grounding a grown woman. The ride to the penthouse took 40 seconds. When the doors opened, the silence of my gilded cage rushed out to meet me. I heard the magnetic locks engage behind me with a heavy thud. Silas had sealed me in. He thought he had contained the problem. He had no idea he had just locked the fox inside the henhouse with all the master controls. The penthouse felt like a tomb of glass and cold marble. I walked to the bedroom and pulled a slim e-reader from under the mattress. It was an old device, but the hardware was heavily modified. I tapped the screen 3 times in a specific sequence. A hidden command prompt flickered to life, connecting via a hardwired emergency line I had installed years ago. I was no longer a daughter in exile. I was the root administrator. The building's neural network hummed in response to my touch. Aether was waking up. Downstairs, the boardroom was surely descending into frantic chaos. Silas had the contracts, but he lacked the digital keys to unlock the source code. My father viewed technology as a servant that should never demand wages. He did not understand that code as poetry written in a locked room. Without my biometric signature, his $19 billion masterpiece was just a pile of expensive scrap paper. I watched the security feed on my device. The lawyers looked like trapped birds. The primary obstacle flashed on my screen in angry red text. Silas had initiated a hardware override from the server room. He was trying to bypass the software locks by physically resetting the mainframe. The power in the penthouse flickered as he rerouted the cooling systems. He was willing to burn the hardware to get what he wanted. My room grew warm as the ventilation died. He thought physical heat would make me fold. He was wrong. I initiated a counter protocol to protect the core data. My fingers moved across the screen with clinical precision. I rerouted the server's primary cooling to the executive wing instead. If Silas wanted to play with fire, he could sweat in his own office. The temperature in the penthouse began to drop as the fans kicked back on. I saw Caleb on the monitor, shouting into a dead phone. He looked small and pathetic in his designer suit. A new notification chirped on the e-reader, changing the power balance. Aether had flagged an offshore transaction coming from Caleb's private account. My brother was shorting Vance Global stock through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. He was betting on our father's failure while smiling to his face. It was a cowardly move, but it gave me a weapon I hadn't expected. Caleb wasn't just incompetent. He was a traitor with a very loud digital trail. I didn't expose him to the authorities yet. Instead, I used my secret crypto reserves to mirror his trades. I amplified the short position by $10 million. If the company crashed, I would walk away with enough capital to buy the wreckage. Silas thought he was protecting a legacy, but his own son was digging the grave. I leaned back against the headboard and watched the stock ticker begin to bleed. The numbers were shifting in my favor. The front door of the penthouse hissed open with a sharp mechanical click. I expected Silas, but a terrified junior lawyer stood there instead. He was trembling so hard the papers in his hand rattled. "Your father says you have 5 minutes to sign the release," he whispered. He held out a tablet with a digital signature line. Behind him, the elevator was already moving back down. I realized then that the building's emergency exits were also locked. I stared at the junior lawyer, a boy named Leo. He looked ready to vanish into the expensive wallpaper. I took the tablet from his shaking hand. The screen displayed a standard IP waiver. It was a suicide note for my career. I did not sign it. Instead, I opened the settings and bridged the device to my e-reader. Leo did not notice the silent data transfer. He only saw my blank face and the darkening penthouse sky. The obstacle was time. Silas was losing his patience. If I did not sign, he would report the AI as stolen property to the police. It was a bluff, but a loud one. The pressure in my chest tightened like a physical weight. My objective was simple. I had to leak the truth before the handcuffs arrived. I tapped a command on my modified reader. The building's smart grid pulsed under my feet. The lights in the foyer flickered. The power balance shifted when the tablet synced with the elevator's internal log. I saw a restricted entry record from an hour ago. Caleb had met with a representative from a rival firm. He was not just shorting the stock. He was selling our trade secrets to cover his losses. My brother was a vulture picking at his own father's bones. This was the mid-scene turn I needed. I had the proof of his treason now. "Tell my father the answer is no," I said. I handed the tablet back to Leo. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the locked exit. "He will ruin you, Juniper. You know he never loses." I smiled, though it felt like a cold blade. He already lost. He just hasn't read the score yet. I pushed him toward the door. The elevator opened with a hiss. He fled into the metal cage, leaving me alone again. I returned to the bedroom. The air was thick with the smell of ozone. Aether was working through the building's infrastructure. I watched the e-reader as it mapped Caleb's secret meetings. He had promised the rival firm a backdoor into the $19 billion deal. Silas was selling a hollow shell to the investors. If the board found out, he would face 20 years. The stakes were rising. My father was a man standing on a landmine. I initiated a lockdown of the executive wing. I did not want Silas escaping into the night. Every biometric scanner in the building turned red. I heard the muffled sirens of the emergency system downstairs. It was a beautiful, chaotic sound. Silas would think it was a glitch. He would scream at the technicians. They would find nothing. I was the ghost in the machine now. I felt a surge of power in my cold fingertips. The micro twist hit as I checked the lobby feed. Two black SUVs had pulled up to the main entrance. They were not police. The men stepping out wore tactical gear and carried heavy cases. Silas had hired private security to breach the penthouse manually. They were bypassing the digital locks with physical force. My digital sanctuary was no longer safe. I had exactly 3 minutes to finish the data upload. The floor began to vibrate. The vibration from the elevator shaft became a rhythmic thud. Silas was coming for his pound of flesh. I rushed to the kitchen and pulled a heavy cast iron pan from a drawer. It was a crude defense against men with tactical gear. My objective was to stay free until the data transfer hit the SEC servers. If they grabbed me now, the truth would die in a vault. I watched the progress bar on my reader. It was stalling. Aether flashed a warning about an internal firewall. Silas had anticipated my move and physically disconnected the main fiber line in the basement. The obstacle was a complete network blackout. I was trapped in a digital void with the heavy hitters closing in. Sweat beaded on my upper lip as the floor shuddered again. I had to find a new path out of the building's infrastructure. My chest burned with a frantic, desperate heat. I needed a signal. The air hissed as the security team breached the service stairs. I realized the building's satellite dish on the roof was still active. It operated on an independent power circuit for the emergency broadcast system. That was my mid-scene turn. If I could bridge my reader to the rooftop transmitter, I could bypass the severed fiber entirely. I scrambled toward the balcony, clutching the device. The wind whipped my hair as I stepped into the night. The men burst into the living room behind me. I heard the crash of a flashbang and the heavy boots on marble. I climbed the exterior ladder to the roof. My knuckles white and bleeding. The pressure was a physical weight pushing against my lungs. Below me, the city lights blurred into a sea of cold electricity. One man reached the balcony railing and aimed a rifle at my feet. "Stop right there, Juniper," he shouted. I didn't stop. I reached the satellite housing and jammed my reader into the maintenance port. The connection light flickered amber, then steady green. I initiated the final data dump. The men in tactical gear were mere steps away. Their leader wore a headset and a grim, professional smile. "You are making this very difficult, kid," he said. He moved to zip-tie my wrists. I felt the cold plastic bite into my skin. I didn't fight him. I just smiled. The leader's radio crackled with a frantic, high-pitched voice. It was Silas, his voice bleeding into the tactical frequency from a desktop override. He sounded small and terrified. Abort the extraction, my father screamed over the comms. She didn't just leak the contract. She sent the offshore logs to the board. The power balance had finally flipped. The mercenaries paused, looking at each other in the moonlight. I watched the data light turn blue. The upload was complete. Silas was no longer the man paying their high salaries. The lead mercenary sighed and cut my zip ties with a tactical knife. He didn't apologize. He simply turned back toward the stairs. "We're done here," he muttered into his mic. I stood alone on the roof, shivering as the adrenaline crashed. My father was ruined. And Caleb was surely fleeing the building. I looked down at the street. A fleet of black sedans was pulling up to the entrance. They were not my father's friends. They carried federal plates. The cold wind on the roof bit through my silk dress. My primary objective was to reach the gala before Silas could spin the narrative. The federal agents were at the door, but they were slow. I needed to move faster than the law. I descended the ladder, my bleeding knuckles gripping the cold rungs. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached the balcony and ducked back inside the silent, ruined penthouse. The primary obstacle was my own father's desperation. Silas had locked down the elevator again, this time to keep the authorities out. I was trapped in the very cage I had just liberated. The air smelled of burnt circuits and panic. I needed to reach the ballroom 10 floors below. I grabbed my mother's vintage coat and a heavy silver paperweight. I smashed the glass of the emergency fire axe cabinet. The alarm began to scream. I swung the axe into the service elevator's mechanical bypass panel. My vision blurred from the exertion, but I didn't stop. A sparks showered mid-scene turn arrived when the panel hissed open. Aether had survived the power cycles through its hidden. I decentralized nodes wired into the secondary smart grid. The AI bypassed the manual lock and opened the doors for me. I stepped into the dark lift and plummeted toward the basement. I wasn't running away. I was heading straight into the heart of the enemy's final party. The gala was a sea of black ties and expensive perfume. I stepped out of the service hall into the ballroom. The music was a string quartet playing something light and oblivious. Silas was at the podium, his face a mask of sweating stone. He saw me enter and his hand tightened on the microphone. The guests didn't know the ship was sinking. They just saw the billionaire's daughter in a torn dress. I walked toward him. I reached the front of the stage as the music died. Silas leaned in, his voice a low growl only I could hear. "You have destroyed us both, Juniper. Stop this now." I didn't whisper back. I took the microphone from his hand. The feedback shrieked through the gilded hall. "The $19 billion deal is dead," I announced to the silent crowd. "And my father is currently under federal investigation for securities fraud." The room turned into a riot. Caleb tried to grab my arm, his face pale with fury. "You're insane," he hissed, his grip bruising my skin. I pulled a small flash drive from my coat pocket. "I have the logs of your short trades, Caleb. You bet against our own blood." He recoiled as if I had struck him with a physical blade. The power balance was gone. The investors began to swarm the stage, shouting for their money. Silas looked truly old for the first time. The micro twist came when the ballroom doors didn't open for the fleeing guests. The federal agents had finally breached the building's main perimeter. They weren't just here for Silas. They were holding a warrant for the entire executive board, including my brother. I stood in the center of the chaos, a calm island in a storm of panic. Then, my phone vibrated in my pocket. Aether had cached one final discovery, before the servers died a third offshore account. It was in my mother's name. The federal agents flooded the ballroom like a dark tide. Their boots crunched on fallen crystal flutes. I stared at the screen of my phone, mesmerized by the name on the account. My mother had been dead for 10 years. Silas had used her identity as a ghost bridge for his most illegal transactions. This was the ultimate betrayal. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. I looked at my father. He was watching the lead agent approach with hollow eyes. My primary objective was now total liquidation. I needed to ensure Silas could never use my mother's memory as a shield again. The obstacle was the federal seizure itself. Once the government froze the assets, my window for surgical destruction would close forever. I had to move faster than the Department of Justice. I tapped a series of commands into Aether. The AI began to drain the ghost account into a secure trust for the company's displaced employees. The pressure escalated as Silas lunged for my phone. He was a cornered animal, stripped of his dignity. "Give it here, you ungrateful brat," he hissed. I stepped back, and a tall agent intercepted him. Silas was forced against a gilded pillar. The guests were being herded toward the exits, their names recorded by grim-faced officials. Caleb sat on the edge of the stage, his head in his hands. He was crying, but I felt no pity for him. A mid-scene turn arrived when the lead agent looked at me. He didn't see a victim. He saw a person of interest. "Miss Vance, we need that device," he said firmly. I held his gaze without blinking. "This device contains the evidence of a multi-billion-dollar fraud," I replied. "But it also contains my proprietary intellectual property." I was drawing a line in the sand. I would cooperate, but only on my terms. I needed to keep control of Aether. I made an irreversible decision in that moment. I initiated a self-destruct sequence on the Vance global servers. I wasn't just deleting files. I was wiping the firmware of every computer in the building. If I couldn't own the infrastructure, neither would the government. The lights in the ballroom flickered as the data centers began to melt down. Silas let out a choked sound of despair. He knew exactly what that flicker meant. His legacy was evaporating in real time. The power balance shifted as the agent realized I held the only remaining copies. He signaled his team to wait. I turned my back on the chaos and walked toward the tall windows. Outside, the city was a grid of light waiting for a new master. I felt the weight of the silver paperweight in my pocket. It was a relic of a world that no longer existed. My mother's name was finally clean. I had scrubbed the filth away. Caleb looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "What did you do, Juniper?" "We had a chance to fix it." I shook my head slowly. "You had a chance to be honest, Caleb. You chose to be a parasite." I watched the federal agents begin to cuff the board members. It was a silent, efficient harvest. The $19 billion deal was a ghost. The Vance empire was a smoldering ruin. I felt a strange sense of peace in the destruction. The primary conflict was over, but a new pressure emerged. Aether sent a final alert to my device. The ghost account hadn't just been used for money. It contained a series of encrypted messages addressed to me. My mother had known Silas was a thief. She had left me the keys to his downfall years ago. I realized I hadn't been acting alone. I was the final stroke of a plan set in motion before I was 20. I handed the phone to the lead agent. "The password is my mother's birthday," I said. He took it with a gloved hand. He didn't know he was holding the detonator for a dozen more scandals. I walked toward the exit, my head held high. The guards didn't stop me this time. I was no longer the daughter of a billionaire. I was the woman who had burned the sky to see the stars. I stepped into the night. The micro twist hit me as I reached the sidewalk. A black town car was waiting. But the driver wasn't anyone I recognized. He handed me a physical envelope. Inside was a single key and a coordinate for a private hangar. The note was written in my mother's unmistakable handwriting. "The real Aether is waiting for you, Juniper. Finish the job." The date on the note was only 2 days old. Someone was still alive and watching me. The envelope felt like a slab of cold lead in my hand. I stared at the driver, but his face remained a blank mask behind the glass. My objective was simple: reach the hangar and uncover the truth behind my mother's ghost. The primary obstacle was the perimeter of federal agents, still swarming the sidewalk. I slipped the note into my coat and walked toward the car. The smell of exhaust and expensive leather filled the air. My heart beat against my bruised ribs. I settled into the back seat as the car pulled away from the curb. The city blurred into streaks of neon and gray rain. I opened the envelope again to examine the key. It was an old-fashioned brass bit, etched with a serial number I recognized from my childhood. This was the key to my mother's private studio. The pressure in my chest increased as I realized the scale of the deception. Silas had told me he sold that property years ago. The driver took a sharp turn toward the industrial district near the coast. I watched the e-reader in my lap. Aether was still sending encrypted packets to an unknown destination. The mid-scene turn arrived when the car's console flickered to life. A voice I hadn't heard in a decade filled the cabin. "Juniper, do not look back at the building." It was a recording, but it sounded terrifyingly live. My mother's voice was steady and calm. I felt my skin crawl. "I knew your father would try to bury the code." The recording continued. The power balance shifted as I realized the AI wasn't just my creation. It was a collaborative bridge built across time. My mother had designed the initial heuristic layers before she died. She had been protecting me from Silas since the very beginning. I wasn't just a coder. I was the guardian of a legacy. The driver accelerated as a black SUV appeared in our rearview mirror. The chase began in the narrow corridors of the shipyard. The obstacle was no longer just the law. Silas had loyalists outside the corporate structure who were desperate to reclaim the drive. The car swerved between rusted shipping containers, the tires screaming on the wet asphalt. I gripped the door handle, my knuckles turning white. "Hold on, Miss Vance," the driver said. He didn't sound like a chauffeur anymore. He sounded like a soldier. I braced for impact. We burst through a chain link fence and skidded toward a secluded hangar. The SUV behind us hit a pile of pallets and spun out. I jumped from the car before it had fully stopped. The air tasted of salt and jet fuel. My objective was right in front of me. A reinforced steel door marked with a familiar crest. I shoved the brass key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. I stepped inside the darkness. The hangar was silent, lit only by the rhythmic pulse of server racks. This was the real Aether. It was a massive, decentralized hub that Silas never knew existed. The mid-scene turn hit me when I saw the figure sitting at the primary console. It was Leo, the junior lawyer who had looked so terrified in the penthouse. He wasn't trembling now. He was typing with a predatory speed. "Welcome home, Juniper," he said. He didn't look up. Leo explained that he had been working for my mother's estate for years. He was the one who had facilitated the secret trades and the data leaks. The pressure intensified as I realized I had been a pawn in a larger game. "Silas is just the first domino," Leo said. "The $19 billion deal was a lure to bring the others out." He pointed to a screen showing a list of international bank accounts. These were the men who truly ran the world. I walked to the console and looked at the data. I made an irreversible decision to finish what my mother started. I didn't just want to ruin Silas, I wanted to dismantle the entire network of corruption. I placed my hand on the biometric scanner. The system recognized me instantly. The servers roared to life, their fans sounding like a jet engine. We were about to launch a digital strike that would change everything. I felt a cold resolve. The micro twist came as the final file decrypted on the main screen. It wasn't a bank account or a ledger of bribes. It was a live video feed from a secure room in a different country. My mother was sitting in a chair, looking directly into the camera. She wasn't a recording. She was holding a newspaper dated for tomorrow. "The game is finally starting, Juniper," she whispered. My world shattered and reformed in a single, terrifying heartbeat. The screen pulsed with the light of a living ghost. I stood frozen in the hangar, my fingers hovering over the console. My objective was to reconcile this impossible image with the grave I had visited for a decade. The primary obstacle was the sheer shock of her survival. It threatened to derail my focus as federal sirens wailed in the distance. Leo watched me with a knowing, heavy silence. My mother's eyes on the screen were sharp and calculating. She was waiting for me. The lie I had lived was a cage made of grief and hidden code. I had believed I was protecting a memory, but I was actually refining a weapon. The truth was far more complex. I was not just a grieving daughter or a vengeful coder. I was a successor. I am the architect of my own world. I whispered. The lie of invisibility vanished. I stepped into the light of the servers. The truth was that I had finally outgrown my father's shadow. A mid-scene turn arrived when a data packet from her location decrypted. It was a map of the global financial nodes her AI had already compromised. The power balance shifted entirely. Silas was not the final boss. He was merely the first barrier to be dismantled in a much larger restoration. I felt a surge of cold, refined purpose. My mother hadn't just survived. She had conquered the digital frontier, while I was still learning to crawl through its back doors. I looked at Leo and nodded once. We began the final sequence to lock the offshore accounts forever. The pressure of the federal pursuit felt distant now. We were operating in a space where law and borders didn't exist. My mother watched every keystroke with a faint, prideful smile. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I was her equal. We were two ghosts, finally ready to haunt the living. The servers roared as the transmission reached its critical peak. The internal conflict resolved into a singular, icy resolve. I chose to delete the last traces of Silas Vance from the global registry. He would exist only as a cautionary tale in a courtroom. I had dismantled the corruption, but I had also claimed its power. The room hummed with the energy of $1 billion redirected dollars. The employee funds were safe. The villains were broke. I felt the weight of the silver paperweight in my pocket one last time. The twist hit as the video feed began to pixelate and dissolve. My mother's image flickered. And for a second, the background behind her changed. She wasn't in a safe house. She was sitting in a secure facility that mirrored the boardroom perfectly, monitoring us through hidden sensors she had rigged years ago. The screen went black, and the hangar doors began to cycle open. A single, familiar shadow stood silhouetted against the morning sun. The silhouette resolved into my mother, stepping out of the light and into the physical world.